He left while she was counting her breaths. In a brightly lit hospital room with machines echoing the rhythm of a life about to begin, Leo Whitman checked his phone one last time, then walked out. Nurses saw. A doctor paused. No one stopped him. An hour later, beneath soft chandeliers and polite applause, he slipped a ring onto another woman's finger, Khloe Bennett. And smiling as if nothing had been taken, back in the delivery room, Skylar Whitman didn't call his name again. She didn't need to, because the man who abandoned her in labor had no idea she already held the only signature standing between him and his $400 million future. If you believe silence can be stronger than revenge, stay with this story. Tell me where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. And if stories about dignity, truth, and consequences matter to you, consider subscribing. Skylar Whitman had always believed that silence, when chosen deliberately, was not weakness, it was control. She had built her life on that principle long before she ever met Leo. At Redwood Capital, a New York-based investment firm known for its aggressive acquisitions and immaculate legal shielding, Skylar held a position that rarely drew attention but carried quiet authority. As a senior legal compliance officer, her role was not to create deals nor to celebrate them. Her role was to examine them line by line, clause by clause, and decide whether they deserved to exist. Most people in the firm knew her only by reputation. Precise, reserved, unshakable. She didn't attend office parties. She didn't linger in hallways. She didn't speak unless necessary. But when her name appeared at the bottom of a document, it meant something had survived scrutiny. Or it hadn't. At 8 months pregnant, Skylar still worked from her home office overlooking the Hudson. Her desk was clean. Her files were categorized. Her calendar remained intact. The only disruption was physical, the slow, deliberate movement of a body preparing to give life. Even that she handled with the same discipline. Her doctor had advised rest. Her colleagues had suggested maternity leave early. Skylar declined both. Not out of stubbornness, out of timing, because somewhere within Redwood's internal system, a deal was approaching her desk, a deal she had been quietly tracking for weeks without anyone knowing. And that deal belonged to Leo. Leo Whitman, her husband of 5 years, was everything Skylar was not. He was visible, charismatic, forward-moving. As the founder and CEO of a fast-rising fintech company called Ardent Pay, Leo had built his reputation on speed-closing deals, quickly scaling aggressively, speaking confidently, even when the ground beneath him was still forming. Investors liked him. Boards trusted him. And lately, he had begun to believe that momentum could replace caution. The $400 million deal he was chasing was supposed to be his defining moment. A strategic acquisition backed by Redwood Capital that would position Ardent Pay among the top-tier financial platforms in the country. He had talked about it often, at dinner, in passing. Late at night when he thought Skylar was only half listening. She never interrupted. She never revealed that she already knew more about the deal than he did. Because Redwood's internal routing system did not operate on relationships. It operated on risk. And Skylar was the final gate. At home, their marriage existed in a quieter space than either of their careers. There had been a time when Leo filled the apartment with energy ideas spilling over conversations, spontaneous plans, late-night laughter. That time had passed gradually, not abruptly. Now their evenings were structured around absence. Leo returned late more often than not. When he did, he carried the residue of other rooms, calls, unfinished thoughts elsewhere. His attention came in fragments. Skylar noticed, not with suspicion, with observation. She had learned long ago that patterns told clearer stories than words. It began with small deviations. Leo started taking calls on the balcony instead of the living room. He began placing his phone face down more frequently. He responded to messages with a kind of immediacy he no longer showed at home. None of it individually meant anything. Together, it formed a rhythm. Skylar did not ask questions. She adjusted her awareness. On a Tuesday evening, while organizing digital expense reports, something she occasionally did out of habit rather than necessity, she'd noticed a charge that did not align with Leo's typical patterns. A boutique hotel in Soho. Midday. No corresponding business meeting on his shared calendar. She clicked into the timestamp, noted it, closed the file. The next day, there was another. Different location, same structure. Skylar didn't confront him. Instead, she opened a separate document on her laptop. A blank file. She titled it with nothing more than a date and began to log. Time, location, discrepancy. No assumptions, no conclusions, just facts. That was how she had always worked. Emotion could wait. Evidence came first. Weeks passed. Her body grew heavier, her steps slower. But her mind remained exact. The entries accumulated. Phone calls that ended when she entered the room. Messages that arrived late at night. A shift in Leo's tone, less irritation, more distraction. And then eventually a name. Not spoken aloud, not confessed, but inferred. Khloe Bennett. Skylar had seen the name once before, years ago in passing, during the early months of her relationship with Leo. A story mentioned briefly. A relationship that had ended before Skylar ever entered his life. At the time, it had been irrelevant. Now it was data. Khloe worked in public relations, corporate branding, the kind of work that intersected naturally with high-growth startups seeking visibility. Skylar did not investigate her. She didn't need to. Because Leo's behavior provided enough structure. Meetings that extended beyond necessity. Travel that no longer aligned with company schedules. And most telling of all, a new kind of urgency, not the urgency of business, the urgency of anticipation. Skylar recognized it immediately. She had seen it in negotiations before, when someone believed they were on the edge of gaining something they should not. At Redwood, she had built her career identifying exactly that moment and responding accordingly. One afternoon, as she reviewed incoming deal pipelines, remotely a familiar name appeared in the internal system. Ardent Pay Acquisition Proposal. Status pending compliance review. Assigned Skylar Whitman. She didn't react outwardly. She opened the file and began reading. The numbers were strong at first glance. Growth projections optimistic. Market positioning compelling. But beneath the surface, there were inconsistencies, minor adjustments in valuation, revenue recognition timelines that leaned forward, nothing illegal on its own, but collectively fragile. She flagged the sections, marked them for further verification, closed the file. Then, almost as an afterthought, she added a new entry to her personal document. Not about the deal, about Leo, time, behavior, pattern, still no conclusions, just alignment. That evening, Leo came home later than usual. He loosened his tie as he entered, glancing briefly toward the kitchen where Skylar stood, one hand resting lightly against the curve of her stomach. "Long day," he said. It wasn't an apology, it wasn't an explanation, just a statement. Skylar nodded once. "I made dinner," she replied. Her voice was even, neutral. They ate at the table, the space between them filled not with tension but with absence. Leo spoke about the deal, about how close it was, about how Redwood was the final step. "She's tough, whoever's reviewing it," he added with a faint smile. "They're asking for everything." Skylar took a sip of water. "Then give them everything she said." Leo nodded, distracted already. He didn't notice the precision in her words. He didn't see the way she watched him, not with anger, not with hurt, but with clarity. Because Skylar already understood something Leo did not. That decisions were not made in moments of confrontation. They were made long before. In silence, in observation, in the careful collection of truth. And by the time Leo would finally realize where he stood, it would already be too late to negotiate. Khloe Bennett did not return to Leo Whitman's life by accident. She returned by timing. The kind of timing that feels like coincidence to one person and inevitability to another. It began at a corporate networking event in Manhattan, one of those carefully curated evenings where ambition dressed itself in politeness. Glass walls, soft lighting conversations layered with intent. Leo had attended for visibility. Khloe had attended for positioning. They recognized each other almost immediately, not because of lingering emotion, because of unfinished narratives. Leo, she had said, her tone measured as if testing whether the name still belonged to him. Khloe, he replied, with the same restrained surprise. They didn't embrace. They didn't hesitate either. They spoke like two people who had once known each other too well and had spent years pretending that knowledge no longer existed. Khloe Bennett had changed in ways that aligned neatly with the world Leo now occupied. She worked in high-level corporate communications, specializing in brand rehabilitation and strategic exposure. Companies brought her in when they needed to reshape perception before investors noticed cracks. She understood visibility. More importantly, she understood leverage. Their conversation that night began with neutral ground careers timelines, the expected exchange of success stories. But beneath the surface, something else moved. Recognition, not of love, of compatibility, the kind built on shared ambition rather than shared values. Leo mentioned ardent pay, the expansion, the acquisition. Khloe listened carefully, not impressed, evaluating. You're close to something big, she said. Leo smiled, closer than it looks. That was enough. They exchanged numbers, not with urgency, with intention. The first messages were predictable, professional, occasional, structured around work. Khloe offered insights into media positioning for large-scale acquisitions. Leo responded with updates on deal progression. The conversation remained within acceptable boundaries, at least on the surface. But boundaries, like structures, depend on maintenance. And Leo had already begun to neglect his. The shift was subtle. Messages extended beyond business hours. Responses became quicker, more frequent. The tone changed, not dramatically, but enough. Khloe noticed immediately. She didn't accelerate. She allowed it to unfold, because she understood something Leo had forgotten. That people reveal themselves most clearly when they believe they are in control. Their first private meeting was framed as a strategy discussion. A restaurant in Midtown, neutral location, professional context. Leo arrived early. Khloe arrived composed. They spoke about the deal, about investor perception, about how timing narrative and visibility could influence valuation. It was all valid, all useful, and entirely unnecessary for what Leo actually needed. But Leo didn't question that, because Khloe made him feel aligned, seen, supported in ways that felt familiar echoes of a version of himself that existed before responsibility had weight. That was the first shift. The second came easier. Another meeting, less formal. No laptops this time, no documents, just conversation. They didn't speak about Skylar. Leo didn't mention her. Khloe didn't ask. Omission in this case was more powerful than acknowledgement. By the third meeting, the pattern had established itself. And patterns once formed rarely require reinforcement. They simply continue. At home, Skylar's observations remained consistent. She didn't need to see Khloe. She didn't need confirmation, because Leo's behavior had already created a structure too precise to misinterpret. The late meetings, the extended silences, the small but distinct shift in how he occupied space. He was present physically, absent entirely. Skylar adjusted nothing outwardly. She maintained routine, meals, work, medical appointments. But internally, she refined her process. Her document grew. Each entry remained objective. Date, time, action. She added attachments now. Screenshots of financial discrepancies, copies of expense reports, hotel invoices forwarded quietly from shared accounts. She didn't label them as betrayal. She labeled them as evidence, because language matters. And she was preparing for something that required clarity, not emotion. At Redwood Capital, the ardent pay file deepened. Skylar reviewed additional documents submitted by Leo's team. updated projections, revised revenue streams, adjusted timelines. Each revision attempted to smooth inconsistencies. Each revision created new ones. She marked them carefully, not rejecting, not approving, holding. Because delay in certain contexts is not hesitation, it is pressure. Marcus Hale, the senior partner overseeing the deal, sent a brief internal message. Need this cleared soon. Skylar responded with equal brevity. Pending verification. No elaboration, no urgency. Marcus trusted her process. Everyone at Redwood did, because Skylar didn't block deals unnecessarily. But when she paused one, there was always a reason. Leo, meanwhile, felt the shift but misinterpreted it. He saw the delays from Redwood as procedural, temporary, something that could be resolved with influence. And Khloe, positioned exactly where she needed to be, reinforced that belief. Deals like this always stall at the end, she told him one evening, seated across from him in a private lounge overlooking the city. It's where control shifts. You just need to manage perception. Leo nodded. That's what you're good at, he said. Khloe smiled faintly, among other things. She didn't ask about Skylar. She didn't need to, because Leo had already created the space where that question no longer existed. One night, Leo returned home later than usual. Skylar was in the living room reviewing documents on her tablet, a soft lamp casting light across the quiet space. You're still up, he said, surprised. I had work, she replied. Her tone was steady. Leo loosened his jacket, placing it over a chair. Things are getting intense, he said. This deal, it's everything right now. Skylar looked at him, not searching, not questioning, simply registering. I understand, she said. And she did, more than he realized. Leo moved through the room, distracted, already half engaged in a message lighting up his phone. Skylar watched the brief flicker of his attention shift away again. Another entry. Not written yet, but already formed. Later that night, after Leo had fallen asleep, Skylar remained awake. Her laptop open, the Arden Pay file displayed. She cross-referenced one final set of numbers, aligned timelines, matched transactions. And then she saw it. A small inconsistency, not large enough to alarm, but precise enough to matter. A transfer, routed through a secondary account, timed alongside one of Leo's unexplained absences. She didn't react. She highlighted it, added a note, saved the file, then opened her personal document. Date, time, transaction, no assumptions, still. Because the story was not complete. Not yet. But it was forming, piece by piece, quietly. And while Leo believed he was building something larger than himself, Skylar was ensuring that everything he built would be measured, not by ambition, but by truth. And truth, once fully assembled, does not argue. It simply stands. Pressure, when it builds gradually, rarely announces itself in dramatic ways. It settles instead into the quiet spaces between decisions shaping behavior long before consequences become visible. Leo Whitman did not recognize the full weight of it yet, but it had already begun to alter how he moved through his own life. At Arden Pay, the atmosphere had shifted from ambition to urgency. The $400 million acquisition was no longer simply an opportunity, it had become an expectation. Investors had already adjusted their projections around it. Internal teams had begun preparing for integration. The narrative, once spoken as possibility, was now being treated as certainty. Marcus Hale, the senior partner at Redwood Capital overseeing the deal, was not a man who repeated himself often. When he did, it was because something had failed to align. We're close, Marcus had said during a scheduled call, his tone measured but unmistakably firm. But close doesn't close deals. Compliance needs clarity, Leo, not momentum. Leo leaned back in his chair, his office overlooking a skyline that reflected his own sense of scale. He maintained his composure, responding with confidence that had carried him through countless negotiations. You'll have everything you need, he said. We're tightening the final pieces now. Marcus paused briefly as if weighing whether to elaborate further. Then he added, make sure those pieces are real. The call ended without tension, but not without implication. Leo told himself that this was standard, that final stage scrutiny always felt heavier than it was. The Redwood's compliance team, whoever they were, simply needed reassurance. He did not yet understand that reassurance would not be enough. Khloe Bennett, on the other hand, understood pressure as a tool rather than an obstacle. She had built her career in environments where perception often preceded reality, and she knew how to navigate that space with precision. Where Leo saw delays as procedural friction, Khloe recognized them as signals. They met that evening in a private suite reserved under a corporate account, a setting chosen not for discretion, but for control. The conversation began with strategy, but it did not remain there for long. You're being slowed down, Khloe observed, reviewing a summary Leo had shared with her. That doesn't happen unless someone is looking very closely. It's compliance, Leo replied, pouring himself a drink. They always push at the end. Khloe did not immediately respond. Instead, she considered the documents again, her expression thoughtful rather than concerned. This isn't just pushing, she said after a moment. This is someone mapping your structure. And if they're mapping it, they're finding where it doesn't hold. Leo dismissed the implication with a small wave of his hand. Everything holds, he said. We've reviewed it internally. Khloe looked at him, then, not critically, but with a kind of measured distance. Internal reviews are designed to confirm what you already believe, she said. External reviews exist to challenge it. There was no accusation in her voice, only clarity. Leo felt it, but chose not to dwell on it. Instead, he shifted the conversation, as he often did, toward certainty. Once this clears, he said, everything changes. Khloe held his gaze for a moment, then nodded slightly. Yes, she said, it will. What she did not say was that change rarely follows the direction people expect. At home, Skylar's world continued to operate within a different kind of precision. While Leo navigated conversations built on projection, she remained grounded in verification. Her work, both professional and personal, had begun to converge, not through intention, but through alignment. The Arden Pay file had grown significantly since it first reached her desk. Each revision submitted by Leo's team had added layers of complexity, rather than resolving existing concerns. Numbers had been adjusted, language refined, supporting documents expanded. On the surface, the deal appeared stronger with each iteration. Beneath that surface, however, inconsistencies persisted. Skylar reviewed the materials methodically, cross-referencing financial statements against transaction records, comparing timelines with external data sources, and noting each deviation with the same careful neutrality she applied to everything else. She did not rush. She did not speculate. She built. At the same time, her personal record continued to develop alongside it. The separation between the two remained clear in structure, but not in significance. Each entry, whether tied to Leo's behavior or to the deal itself, contributed to a broader understanding that was still forming. One evening, as she sat at her desk reviewing a new batch of documents, she paused over a familiar pattern. A series of expenses routed through secondary accounts, each linked to dates she had already logged. The correlation was not absolute, but it was consistent enough to matter. She opened both files, side by side, professional and personal, and examined them without emotion. There was no need for reaction, only recognition. She highlighted the entries, added notes, and saved her work. Then she closed both documents and sat in silence for a moment, her hand resting lightly against her stomach, as the child inside her shifted a quiet reminder of something that existed entirely outside the structures she was analyzing. For the first time, the two worlds she had been managing, her role as a compliance officer and her role as a wife, did not feel separate. They felt parallel and moving toward the same point. Leo's absence that night did not register as unusual anymore. He had informed her earlier briefly that he would be working late. The phrase had become routine, stripped of detail and expectation. Skylar acknowledged it with a nod, as she always did. She did not ask where. She did not ask with whom, because questions in her experience rarely produced answers that mattered. Behavior did, and behavior had already spoken. At Ardent Pay, internal tension had begun to surface. Senior team members, sensing the prolonged delay from Redwood, started to express concerns in meetings that had previously been dominated by optimism. Timelines were being revisited. Contingency plans, once unnecessary, were now being discussed. Leo maintained control of the narrative. "This is standard," he repeated. "We're in the final stage. They're just being thorough." His confidence remained intact, but it required more effort to sustain. Because beneath the surface he could feel something shifting, something he could not yet define. And rather than confront that uncertainty directly, he sought reinforcement elsewhere. With Khloe, conversations became less structured, more personal, though still framed within the context of the deal. She provided not only strategic input, but also affirmation, the kind that does not challenge, only supports. "You've built something strong," she told him. "Don't let process make you doubt that." Leo accepted the reassurance without examining its foundation. Because doubt once acknowledged has a way of expanding. Days passed, documents moved, messages were sent. And within Redwood's system, the Ardent Pay file remained in a state that Leo could not see, but Skylar understood completely. Not approved, not rejected, held, because Skylar was not yet finished. She did not move toward conclusions prematurely, and she did not act without completeness. Every inconsistency, every pattern, every detail had to be accounted for, not just individually, but collectively. She knew that when the moment came, it would not be defined by emotion or confrontation. It would be defined by structure, by evidence, by process that allowed no room for interpretation. And until that structure was fully formed, she would continue exactly as she had begun. Quietly, precisely, without interruption. Because control in its truest form is not about force, it is about timing. And Skylar Whitman had always understood that the most decisive moments are the ones no one sees coming until they are already in motion. The night Skylar Whitman went into labor did not arrive with urgency. It came quietly, almost politely, as if even the beginning of new life understood the importance of timing. It started just after midnight. A dull pressure at first, then a tightening that did not fully release. Skylar was awake when it happened, seated at her desk with a file still open on her screen. The apartment was silent, the city beyond the glass reduced to distant movement and light. Leo was home, though not present in any meaningful sense. He had fallen asleep earlier on the couch, his phone still in his hand, a conversation left unfinished. Skylar did not call out to him immediately. She waited, not out of hesitation, but out of certainty. She had read enough, learned enough, prepared enough to recognize the difference between discomfort and inevitability. This was not something that would pass. She closed her laptop slowly, saving her work with the same care she applied to everything else. Then, she stood steadying herself as another wave of pressure moved through her body, stronger this time, undeniable. Only then did she walk toward the living room. "Leo." Her voice was calm, measured. He stirred, disoriented for a moment before focusing on her. "What is it? I think it's time." That was all she said. For a brief second, something close to clarity passed through him. The kind of clarity that belongs to responsibility, to presence, to the understanding that some moments do not allow for distraction. He stood quickly, running a hand through his hair, as if trying to wake himself fully. "Okay," he said. "Okay, let's go." The drive to the hospital was quiet. Leo kept his eyes on the road, his movements efficient but not hurried. Skylar sat beside him, one hand resting against her abdomen. Her breathing controlled her gaze steady. Neither of them spoke much. There was nothing to explain. The city felt distant even as they moved through it. At the hospital, the environment shifted immediately. Fluorescent lights, controlled urgency. the steady rhythm of systems designed for moments exactly like this. Nurses guided Skylar through intake with practiced precision. Questions were asked. Monitors were attached. Time was marked. Leo remained nearby, present, in the way that presence is often defined: physically close, emotionally elsewhere. He answered when addressed, signed where necessary, checked his phone when no one was looking directly at him. Skylar noticed. Of course she did. But noticing did not change her behavior. She focused on what was in front of her: the contraction patterns, the instructions from the nurse, the quiet internal work of preparing her body for what it was about to do. Time began to lose structure. Minutes stretched, then collapsed. Pain came in waves, each one stronger than the last, each one requiring a deeper level of focus. Leo stepped out once, then returned, then stepped out again. Each absence slightly longer than the one before. At first, it could have been explained. Phone calls, work, logistics. But patterns once established do not need explanation. Skylar did not ask where he went. She did not ask who he was speaking to. Because by now, those answers would not change anything that mattered. It happened during a pause between contractions, a brief moment where the room settled, where even the machines seemed to quiet. Leo's phone vibrated. He glanced at it, and something in his expression shifted, not dramatically, but enough. Recognition. Then urgency. He hesitated, just for a second. Then he looked toward Skylar. She needs me for something, he said. The sentence was incomplete, not fully formed, not entirely truthful. Skylar met his eyes. She did not ask who. She did not ask why. She simply looked at him with a clarity that required no confirmation. Another contraction began to build, slow and rising. Leo shifted his weight. "I'll be right back," he added. A promise without structure. Skylar held his gaze for 1 second longer than necessary. Then she nodded. Okay, that was all. No accusation. No request for him to stay. No attempt to hold him in place. Because she understood something Leo did not. That people do not leave because they are forced to. They leave because they choose to. And once that choice is made, nothing said in that moment can undo it. Leo turned and walked out of the room. The door closed behind him with a quiet finality that no one else in the room seemed to register. But Skylar did. Not emotionally, not dramatically, simply as fact. The hallway camera recorded everything. Leo walking with purpose. Phone already pressed to his ear, his pace increasing as he moved further from the room, further from the moment, further from the life that was about to enter the world. No one stopped him. Because from the outside, nothing about his movement appeared unusual, only incomplete. Inside the delivery room, time resumed its forward motion. The nurse adjusted the monitor. "Your husband stepped out," she asked gently. Skylar nodded once. "He'll be back," the nurse said. It was not a question. Skylar did not respond. Because she did not know if that was true. And more importantly, it no longer mattered. Another contraction hit stronger than the last, pulling her attention entirely inward. Pain demanded focus. Breath required control. Everything else receded. The room, the absence, the unanswered question. All of it became secondary to the immediate reality of what her body was doing. Leo, meanwhile, had already stepped outside the hospital. The air was cooler, the noise of the city sharper. His voice, when he spoke, carried a different tone, now less restrained, more directed. "I'm on my way," he said. Khloe's voice on the other end was calm, but there was an undercurrent of insistence. "This can't wait," she told him. "If you want this to work, you need to be here." Leo hesitated again. But this time, the hesitation was shorter. Because he had already made the decision the moment he stepped out of that room. "I'll be there," he said. And then he moved. Not back towards Skylar, but away. Back inside the hours unfolded without him. The contractions intensified. The intervals shortened. The work became all-consuming. Skylar did not ask for updates. She did not check the door. She did not look for him. Because her focus had narrowed to a single point, the child she was bringing into the world. The nurses stayed. The doctor returned. Instructions were given. Support was offered. But the space beside her remained empty. And everyone in the room understood it, even if no one said it aloud. At one point, a nurse asked softly, "Is there someone we should call for you?" Skylar shook her head. No. Her voice was steady, not because the situation was easy, but because she had already adjusted to it. Hours later, as the final stage approached, the room filled with a different kind of intensity. Not panic, not urgency, but culmination. The doctor positioned. The nurses prepared. Skylar gathered what remained of her strength. And in that moment, with no one beside her, except those who were paid to be there, she did not think of Leo. She did not think of where he had gone. She did not think of what he was doing, because some moments redefine priorities completely. And this was one of them. When the child finally cried, the sound cut through everything, clear, immediate, alive. Skylar closed her eyes for a brief second, the tension in her body releasing all at once, replaced by something quieter. Not relief, not joy in the way it is often described, but completion. The nurse placed the baby in her arms, small, warm, real. Skylar looked down, her expression unchanged, but her attention absolute. "Hello," she said softly. It was the first word she had spoken that carried something beyond control. Not emotion displayed, but emotion acknowledged. In another part of the city, under different lights and a different kind of attention, Leo Whitman stood beside Khloe Bennett, and as he reached for her hand, he did not know that at that exact moment, everything he believed he was building had already begun to shift beyond his control. Because while he had chosen where to be, he had not understood what he was leaving behind. There are moments in life that do not compete with each other. They divide reality instead. On one side, something begins. On the other, something is abandoned. The distance between those two moments is not measured in miles, but in decisions. That night, two events unfolded in parallel, each marked by ceremony, each witnessed, each recorded in different ways. Only one of them carried truth. At the hospital, the hours following childbirth moved with a quiet, methodical rhythm. The urgency that had filled the room slowly dissolved into routine. Machines were adjusted, forms were completed, soft voices replaced instructions. Skylar Whitman remained in her hospital bed, her body still recovering, her mind already steady. The baby lay beside her, wrapped securely, breathing in small, measured patterns that seemed almost deliberate. Every movement was subtle, every sound contained, as if the child understood the stillness of the room she had entered. A nurse approached with a clipboard. "We'll need a few signatures," she said gently. Skylar nodded. Her hand, though slightly unsteady from exhaustion, moved with the same precision it always had. She read each line before signing, even now, even here. Name of mother, time of birth, medical acknowledgement. Then, spouse present. The nurse paused, glancing briefly at the empty chair beside the bed. Skylar followed her gaze for a fraction of a second. Then she looked back at the form. "No," she said. The word was neither defensive nor explanatory, just accurate. The nurse marked the box. No further questions were asked. Because in environments like this, absence is not unusual. It is simply recorded. Across the city, in a private venue designed for intimacy rather than scale, a different kind of documentation was taking place. Soft lighting cast controlled shadows across polished floors. A string quartet played quietly in the background. Guests, carefully selected, spoke in low voices, their attention focused on the center of the room. Leo Whitman stood at the front, dressed in a tailored suit that fit him with the same precision he applied to his public image. Beside him stood Khloe Bennett, composed, elegant, entirely at ease. There was no mention of timing, no acknowledgement of what existed beyond those walls. Only the structure of the ceremony itself. The officiant spoke clearly, guiding them through vows that had been written to sound personal, but carried no history that required explanation. Leo repeated each line without hesitation. Commitment, partnership, future. words that in that moment required no verification. Khloe's voice followed his, steady and assured. She did not look uncertain. She did not look conflicted. Because for her, this was not a disruption. It was alignment. The rings were exchanged. Applause followed. A kiss sealed what had already been decided long before that night. Around them, the guests responded as expected. Smiles, approval, quiet celebration. No one asked questions that might have complicated the scene. Because the kind of people invited to events like this understand that appearances are often more valuable than explanations. Back at the hospital, the night deepened. Skylar remained awake longer than necessary, not out of discomfort, but out of awareness. The room was dim, the sounds reduced to the occasional movement of staff in the hallway, the soft hum of machines, the steady breathing of the child beside her. She did not reach for her phone. There were no messages she expected, no calls she was waiting for. Instead, she observed the small details, the way the baby's hand curled slightly, then relaxed, the way her breathing adjusted when touched, the quiet presence of something entirely new, entirely separate from everything that had existed before. For the first time in days, Skylar's attention was not divided between roles. She was not reviewing documents, not tracking patterns, not analyzing behavior. She was simply present. And yet even in that stillness, something else remained intact. Clarity. Because while her circumstances had changed, her understanding had not. Leo had left. Not temporarily, not accidentally, but by choice. And that choice had already placed everything else into motion. Later that night, a nurse returned with discharge planning materials. "You'll likely be able to go home tomorrow," she explained. "Do you have someone picking you up?" Skylar looked at the baby, then back at the nurse. "I'll arrange it," she said. Again, no elaboration, no request for assistance beyond what was necessary. Because dependence for Skylar had never been a default. It had always been a decision, and she was no longer making that decision. At the reception following the ceremony, Leo moved through conversations with practiced ease. Investors, colleagues, and acquaintances approached him with congratulations, each interaction reinforcing the narrative that had been constructed around him. Success, momentum, control. Khloe remained nearby, occasionally stepping into conversations, guiding them subtly, ensuring that the focus remained where it needed to be. On Leo, on the future, on the deal. Because even here, even now, the $400 million acquisition remained central. It was the reason this moment felt justified, the reason the timing could be rationalized, the reason everything else had been deferred. "You're close, right?" one guest asked, referencing the deal. "Very," Leo replied confidently. "Just final approvals." He believed it. Because belief, when supported by repetition, becomes difficult to challenge. Khloe glanced at him briefly, her expression unreadable for a moment, before she returned to the conversation. She did not correct him. She did not question his certainty. Because she understood that reality in situations like this often arrives without warning. Back at Redwood Capital, the system continued to process information without regard for any of it. Documents were uploaded, reviewed, flagged. The Ardent Pay file remained active, and under Skylar Whitman's control, unmoved. Morning came quietly. At the hospital, light filtered through the window, softening the edges of everything it touched. Skylar had slept only briefly, her rest interrupted but sufficient. The baby stirred. Skylar adjusted slightly, lifting her carefully, supporting her with a natural instinct that required no instruction. There was no rush, no urgency, only progression. A nurse entered with a final set of documents. "Whenever you're ready," she said. Skylar reviewed them, signed, closed the folder, and then, without ceremony, began preparing to leave. Leo did not return. Not that night. Not the next morning. There were no missed calls from him. No messages asking for updates. No acknowledgement of what had happened. Because in his mind, the sequence of events had already been justified by priority. The deal, the opportunity, the future. He believed he had acted within reason, and because no one in his immediate environment challenged that belief, it remained intact. As Skylar was wheeled out of the hospital later that day, the world outside continued as it always had. Traffic moved, people walked. Nothing paused to recognize what had changed. She held her child close, her expression unchanged, her posture steady. There was no visible trace of what had been lost, no outward sign of what had been decided. Only movement. Forward. Because Skylar did not need acknowledgement. She did not need confrontation. She did not need closure in the way most people define it. What she needed, she already had. The truth. Documented, aligned, and waiting. Silence, when extended over time, does not remain empty. It fills itself with structure, with intention, with decisions that do not need to be announced in order to take effect. In the days following her discharge from the hospital, Skylar Whitman did not attempt to restore what had been broken, nor did she pause to define it. She simply continued forward, allowing her actions to replace anything that might otherwise have required explanation. The apartment felt different when she returned, though nothing within it had physically changed. Leo's belongings remained where he had left them. His jacket still hung over the back of the chair. A glass sat on the kitchen counter untouched since the night they had left for the hospital. The space carried the quiet residue of a life that had not yet realized it had already ended. Skylar entered without hesitation. She'd placed the baby, her daughter, gently into the prepared crib near the window, adjusting the blanket with a level of care that did not draw attention to itself. Every movement was measured not out of fragility, but out of control. There were no flowers waiting, no messages on the table, no sign that anyone had considered what her return might require. Skylar did not look for those things. She unpacked her hospital bag, placing each item in its designated space. Laundry was sorted, surfaces were cleared. The environment restructured itself around her presence with the same quiet efficiency she applied to everything else. Then, once the immediate tasks were complete, she sat down at her desk. The laptop opened. The system loaded. Work resumed. Returning to Redwood Capital did not require a formal announcement. Skylar had never fully stepped away. Even during the final weeks of her pregnancy, she had remained connected, reviewing files, responding to internal messages, maintaining continuity. Now that continuity became central again. The Ardent Pay file awaited her. Unchanged in status, still pending, still incomplete. Skylar reviewed the most recent submissions from Leo's team. Additional documents had been uploaded during her brief absence. Revised financial statements, expanded disclosures, updated projections, intended to address previous concerns. At first glance, they appeared thorough. At second glance, they revealed something else. Adjustment without resolution. Numbers had been moved. Language had been refined. But the underlying inconsistencies remained. She noted each one, cross-referenced again, confirmed. There was no urgency in her process, because urgency, when applied incorrectly, leads to oversight. And oversight was not something Skylar allowed. At Ardent Pay, the delay had begun to shift from manageable to noticeable. Internal meetings grew more focused. Questions became more direct. Senior staff members who had initially accepted Leo's assurances without hesitation now required more detailed explanations. Leo provided them. Confidently, repeatedly. Compliance is finalizing their review, he said during one meeting, standing at the head of the conference table. We've addressed everything they asked for. It's just a matter of time. He believed it, or at least he believed it enough to continue saying it. Because the alternative required him to acknowledge something he was not prepared to confront. That the delay was not procedural, it was deliberate. Khloe Bennett, positioned at the intersection of Leo's professional and personal decisions, began to notice the shift as well. Her role had never been formally defined within Ardent Pay, but her influence had grown steadily shaped by proximity and perception. She joined meetings when appropriate, advised on communication strategy, managed external expectations, but beneath that structure, her awareness extended further. She understood how deals moved. More importantly, she understood how they stalled. "This is taking longer than it should," she said one evening, reviewing the latest updates with Leo in his office. "It's a large deal," Leo replied. "They're being thorough." Khloe considered that, then shook her head slightly. "Thorough doesn't repeat itself," she said. "If they keep asking for the same clarifications, it means they're not satisfied with the answers." Leo exhaled slowly, irritation beginning to surface. "We've given them everything," he said. "There's nothing else to provide." Khloe did not respond immediately. Instead, she watched him assessing not the content of his words, but the structure behind them. Confidence she knew often disguised gaps. "Then the problem isn't what you're giving them," she said finally. "It's what they're seeing." Leo frowned. "What is that supposed to mean?" "It means," Khloe continued calmly, "someone on their side is looking deeper than you expected." Skylar, at that exact moment, was doing precisely that. Her review had reached a level of detail that extended beyond standard compliance procedures. Not because she was searching for fault, but because the existing inconsistencies required full resolution. One transaction in particular had drawn her attention repeatedly. A series of fund movements routed through an intermediary account, each one timed in close proximity to entries in her personal log. The correlation, while not absolute, was consistent enough to warrant further examination. She accessed additional records, requested internal verification, traced the path of the funds with the same methodical precision she applied to everything else. The pattern held, not illegal in isolation, but collectively questionable. She documented it, attached supporting evidence, added it to the file, then paused. Not because she was uncertain, but because she understood the significance of what she was assembling. This was no longer a routine compliance review. It was becoming something else. At home, Skylar's routine adjusted seamlessly around her daughter's needs. Feeding schedules, sleep patterns, small quiet interactions that required presence without distraction. She did not separate her roles. She integrated them. Work continued. Care continued. Both received the same level of attention. There was no visible strain, no outward sign of imbalance. Because Skylar did not operate on visible effort. She operated on structure. Leo did not return home, not in the days that followed. He remained in a different apartment, one that Khloe had suggested as temporary, though neither of them defined what that meant. Communication between him and Skylar did not resume. There were no calls, no messages, no attempts to explain. Because Leo believed in some undefined way that explanation could wait until the deal was complete. That everything else could be addressed later. After success, after resolution, after he had secured what he believed mattered most. Skylar did not initiate contact. She did not request clarification. She did not ask for acknowledgement. Because from her perspective, nothing required discussion. Everything had already been demonstrated, and demonstration, unlike explanation, does not require agreement. Back at Redwood, the Ardent Pay file reached a point where further delay would require formal action. Skylar reviewed the complete structure one more time. Every document, every note, every inconsistency. The file, once fragmented, now existed as a cohesive whole. Not a collection of concerns, but a structured narrative, clear, documented, aligned. She closed the file, then opened a new internal form. Request for additional compliance review. The process was standard. The implications were not. Once submitted, the deal would move beyond her desk, into a broader internal examination, one that would involve multiple departments, multiple perspectives, and no direct control from Leo. Skylar read the form carefully. Then, without hesitation, she submitted it. At Ardent Pay, the notification arrived within the hour. Leo read it once. Then again. His expression shifted not dramatically, but enough. "What is this?" he asked, more to himself than to anyone else. Khloe stepped closer, reading over his shoulder. "Internal review escalation," she said quietly. Leo looked at her. "That's not supposed to happen," he said. Khloe did not respond immediately, because she already understood what he was beginning to realize. That the deal was no longer moving forward. It was being examined. Skylar across the city closed her laptop. Her daughter slept beside her undisturbed. The apartment remained quiet, unchanged. And within that stillness, everything had already begun to shift. Not through confrontation, not through declaration, but through process. Because Skylar Whitman had never needed to raise her voice to be heard. She only needed to ensure that when the moment came, the truth would speak for itself. By the time a process becomes visible, it has already been underway for some time. That was something Skylar Whitman understood better than most. At Redwood, capital escalation did not mean panic. It meant structure had reached a threshold where silence was no longer sufficient. The internal review she had initiated did not disrupt the system, it activated it. Departments that had remained peripheral to the Arden pay deal were now formally involved. Risk assessment teams began their independent evaluations. Financial analysts re-examined projections without reliance on the company's submitted summaries. Legal advisors reviewed disclosures with a narrower tolerance for ambiguity. The file, once contained within Skylar's oversight, now expanded outward. But expansion did not dilute control. It reinforced it, because everything now being examined had already been identified. Quietly, precisely, by her. Skylar remained present throughout the process, though not visibly central. She attended scheduled internal briefings via secure video calls, her presence marked not by frequency of speech, but by the weight of what she did say when she chose to speak. There are recurring inconsistencies in transaction routing, she noted during one session, her tone, even her delivery exact. They are not isolated events. They form a pattern that requires full traceability. No embellishment, no interpretation beyond what could be supported. The room, composed of analysts, legal counsel, and senior compliance officers, did not question her statement. They worked from it, because Skylar did not speculate. She confirmed. At home, her environment remained unchanged. Her daughter's presence had introduced a new rhythm, but not disorder. Feeding schedules were integrated into her work intervals. Sleep, though reduced, was managed with efficiency. The apartment remained structured, calm, aligned with her internal state. There were no interruptions she did not account for. No responsibilities she neglected. Because Skylar did not separate personal from professional. She aligned them. And in that alignment, she found control. Leo Whitman, for the first time since the deal had begun, felt something he could not immediately categorize. It was not fear, not yet. It was a disruption of certainty. The internal review notification had been followed by a series of formal requests from Redwood, requests that differed in tone and structure from anything he had received before. They were no longer asking for clarification. They were requesting verification, detailed breakdowns of specific transactions, supporting documentation for adjusted revenue figures, explanations for account movements that until now had not been questioned. Leo responded as he always had. Quickly, confidently, he delegated tasks to his finance team, instructing them to compile whatever was needed to present the information cleanly to ensure that nothing appeared inconsistent. But the requests did not stop. Each response generated new questions. Each submission led to deeper examination. "What exactly are they looking for?" one of his senior analysts asked during a late-night meeting. Leo did not answer immediately, because the question assumed something he had not yet accepted, that Redwood was not searching for reassurance. They were searching for confirmation. Khloe Bennett observed the shift with increasing attention. Her instinct, sharpened by years of navigating corporate perception, recognized the pattern before Leo fully did. "This isn't standard," she said one evening, standing near the window of the apartment they now shared temporarily. "They're not closing. They're building a case." Leo turned towards her, frustration beginning to replace composure. A case for what he asked. There's nothing illegal here. Khloe held his gaze. I didn't say illegal, she replied. I said a case. There was a difference. One Leo was not yet ready to examine. Back at Redwood, the internal review reached a stage where preliminary findings began to consolidate. Patterns that had once appeared as isolated inconsistencies were now clearly connected. Transaction timelines aligned with behavioral data points. Financial adjustments corresponded with external activities that had not been disclosed within official documentation. None of it individually constituted immediate violation. But collectively, it raised concern. Skylar reviewed the compiled findings with the same detachment she had maintained from the beginning. There was no sense of discovery in her process because nothing being revealed was new to her. It was simply being confirmed. She added her notes, attached her original observations, ensured that every point of correlation was supported by documentation. And then she stepped back, not withdrawing, but allowing the process to move forward without her direct intervention. Because at this stage, involvement could be misinterpreted. And Skylar did not allow for misinterpretation. A formal request was sent to Ardent Pay. Subject, additional compliance clarification, Phase 2, ESA review. The language was precise, neutral, unavoidable. It outlined the areas requiring further explanation, each one supported by references to specific documents, transactions, and timelines. It did not accuse. It did not conclude. It simply asked. But the nature of the questions made one thing clear. The deal was no longer progressing. It was being evaluated for integrity. Leo read the request in silence. The room around him felt smaller, though nothing had changed. This doesn't make sense, he said finally, more to himself than to Khloe. We've already addressed these points. Khloe stepped closer, reading the document again, her expression tightening slightly. They're not asking for new information, she said. They're asking you to explain the same information differently. Leo looked at her. And that means they don't believe what you've already told them. The words settled between them not as accusation, but as recognition. Leo exhaled slowly, running a hand through his hair. They're overreaching, he said. This is unnecessary. Khloe did not respond, because she understood that necessity in this context was not defined by Leo. Skylar, at that same moment, was seated at her desk, her daughter resting quietly in a nearby bassinet. The apartment was still the city beyond the window, continuing its movement without awareness of what was unfolding within it. She opened the Ardent Pay file once more, not to review, but to finalize her position. Every document was in place, every inconsistency recorded, every correlation supported. There was nothing left to add, nothing left to clarify. Only one step remained. She drafted a brief internal summary, clear, structured, without language that suggested bias or personal involvement. It outlined the findings, referenced the supporting evidence, and recommended continued review before any approval could be considered. She read it once, then submitted it. At Redwood, the summary moved quickly through the appropriate channels. Senior partners reviewed it. Legal teams assessed it. The decision was not made immediately, but the direction had shifted, irreversibly. Leo did not yet know the full extent of what had been set in motion. He only knew that the deal which had once felt inevitable was now uncertain. And uncertainty, unlike delay, could not be managed through confidence alone. Skylar closed her laptop. The room remained quiet. Her daughter stirred slightly, then settled again. Skylar watched her for a moment, her expression unchanged, her attention steady. There was no satisfaction in what was happening, no sense of victory, because this was not about outcome. It was about alignment. And alignment, once established, does not require reinforcement. It sustains itself. Somewhere across the city, Leo Whitman was still trying to move forward, still believing that the structure he had built could hold, still unaware that the foundation beneath it had already been measured and found to be unstable. Uncertainty does not arrive as a single moment. It unfolds gradually, reshaping confidence into calculation, then into doubt. Leo Whitman had spent years operating in environments where momentum could override hesitation, where decisions were rewarded for their speed rather than their caution. But now, for the first time, momentum had slowed in a way he could neither control nor clearly explain. At Ardent Pay, the atmosphere had shifted from pressure to tension. Meetings that once centered on expansion now revolved around explanation. Internal teams, previously aligned under Leo's direction, began asking questions that required more than reassurance. Financial officers revisited projections. Legal advisors requested clarity on disclosures that had once passed without scrutiny. The language of certainty had begun to erode. Leo stood at the center of it, still composed, still leading, but increasingly aware that the ground beneath him was no longer stable. "We're still on track," he told his executive team. During a late afternoon meeting, his voice measured, his posture controlled. "Redwood is conducting a deeper review." That's expected at this stage? It was not expected, but it was necessary for him to believe that it was. "What kind of review?" one of the senior analysts asked carefully. "This level of detail usually comes earlier." Leo paused for a fraction of a second, then responded. "They're aligning risk exposure with long-term projections," he said. "It's procedural." The explanation was structured, technically plausible, but it did not fully answer the question, and the room felt it. No one challenged him directly, but the silence that followed was no longer neutral. Khloe Bennett observed the shift not just in the company, but in Leo himself. Where he had once moved with fluid certainty, there was now a subtle rigidity in his behavior. His responses were slightly delayed. His focus, though still sharp, required more effort to maintain. She did not confront him immediately. Instead, she watched, because Khloe understood that pressure reveals more than conversation ever could. That evening, in the apartment they now occupied, she found him reviewing documents at the dining table. His laptop opened, multiple windows layered across the screen. "You've read that 3 times, she said quietly, stepping closer. Leo didn't look up immediately. "I'm making sure everything aligns," he replied. Khloe leaned slightly against the edge of the table, her gaze moving across the documents. "Does it?" she asked. Leo exhaled, closing one of the files. "It should," he said. The phrasing did not go unnoticed. Khloe's expression remained neutral, but her attention sharpened. "Should isn't the same as does," she said. Leo finally looked at her. "You think something's wrong?" Khloe held his gaze for a moment, then answered carefully. "I think someone on their side believes something might be." Leo leaned back slightly, his jaw tightening. "They're overanalyzing," he said. "We've already provided everything." Khloe did not argue, because argument would not shift his position. Instead, she changed her approach. "Then find out who's reviewing it," she said. "And why?" That question lingered, because until that moment, Leo had not considered the review as something tied to an individual. To him, Redwood had been an entity, a system, not a person. But systems are operated by people, and people make decisions. The next morning, Leo initiated contact within Redwood through the channels available to him. Not directly with compliance, those lines were restricted, but through relationship managers and intermediaries who could provide insight without breaching protocol. The responses he received were limited, carefully worded, non-committal. But one detail surfaced consistently. "The file is under senior compliance review." Leo pressed further. "Who's leading it?" There was a pause on the other end of the line. Then, "It's assigned to Skylar Whitman." The name did not register immediately, not as information, but as interruption. Leo remained silent for a moment, the words settling into a context he had not anticipated. "That's not possible," he said finally. The response came evenly. "It is. She's the assigned officer on the file." Leo ended the call shortly after. He sat in silence, his mind attempting to reorganize what he had just heard. Skylar, his wife. The woman he had not spoken to since the night he left the hospital. The woman who, as far as he had allowed himself to consider, existed outside the structure of his current priorities. was now central to everything. Across the city, Skylar was working. The morning had begun as all her mornings did, with structure, with sequence, with clarity. Her daughter had woken early, fed quietly, returned to sleep without disruption. The apartment remained still, the rhythm controlled. Skylar's laptop was open. The ardent pay file displayed. She reviewed incoming responses from Leo's team, additional documentation submitted in response to Redwood's latest request. She read them carefully, noting where explanations aligned, noting where they did not. Her process remained unchanged, because the introduction of new information did not alter the method, only the structure. Leo called her. The phone rang once, twice, then stopped. No answer. He called again. The same result. He hesitated before sending a message. "We need to talk." The message was simple, direct, uncharacteristically so. Skylar saw it. She did not respond. Not because she was avoiding him, but because the request did not align with the context. This was no longer a personal conversation. It was a professional process, and she would respond within that structure. Minutes later, an email was sent from Redwood's compliance department to Leo Whitman. Subject, follow-up clarification. Ardent Pay Acquisition Review. The body of the email was precise, structured, impersonal. It outlined specific areas requiring further documentation, referenced previous submissions, and provided a clear deadline for response. At the bottom, Skylar Whitman, Senior Legal Compliance Officer, Redwood Capital Leo, read the email twice. Then a third time. His name, her name, connected. Formally, officially, without acknowledgement of anything beyond the deal itself. He leaned back in his chair, the realization settling into something heavier than surprise. Because this was not coincidence. This was position. Khloe watched him carefully. "What is it?" she asked. Leo turned the laptop toward her. She read the email, then looked up. "That's her?" she asked. Leo nodded. Khloe's expression remained composed, but there was a shift in her posture. A recalculation. "This changes things," she said. Leo let out a slow breath. "Yes," he replied. "It did, but not in the way he hoped." Skylar continued her work, unaffected in appearance, unchanged in process, because from her perspective, nothing had shifted. Leo had entered her professional space, not as her husband, but as a subject under review. And in that space, there were no personal considerations, no history, no emotion, only structure, only evidence, only decision. Leo stared at the email again, as if reading it differently might alter its meaning, but it did not, because meaning once established within the right framework does not change based on interpretation. It remains clear, unavoidable. And for the first time since the deal had begun, Leo Whitman understood something with complete certainty. He was no longer moving toward approval. He was moving toward judgment. Recognition does not always arrive with clarity. Sometimes it comes in fragments, pieces of understanding that resist alignment until they can no longer be ignored. For Leo Whitman, the realization that Skylar was not only involved in his deal but positioned at its center did not immediately translate into strategy. It translated into urgency, not the controlled urgency he was accustomed to in negotiations. Something less structured, more personal. He called her again. This time he let the phone ring longer. He listened to the absence of response as if it might eventually resolve itself. It did not. He ended the call, then immediately began drafting another message, deleting it, rewriting it, adjusting tone without fully knowing what tone was appropriate. Finally he sent, "We should meet. This is important." The words felt insufficient even as he typed them, because importance in this context had already been redefined. Skylar saw the message as it arrived. She was seated at her desk, reviewing a newly submitted financial appendix from Leo's team, her daughter asleep in the bassinet beside her. The apartment was quiet, the late morning light settling across the room in a way that softened everything except her focus. She read the message once, then returned to the document in front of her. Because the request did not require immediate response, not in the way Leo intended. Within Redwood's system, communication followed structure. There were channels, protocols, defined points of contact. Skylar did not deviate from them. When she responded, it was through those channels. Later that afternoon, Leo received a calendar notification. Subject: Ardent Pay Acquisition Review in-person meeting. Location: Redwood Capital, Conference Room 14. B. Attendees: Compliance, Legal, Financial Oversight. No mention of personal context, no acknowledgement of anything beyond the deal. At the bottom, organized by Skylar Whitman. Leo stared at the notification, his reflection faintly visible in the darkened edge of the screen. It was not an invitation. It was a requirement. Khloe stood near the window, watching him, as he processed the information. "She's not avoiding you," she said quietly. Leo didn't respond immediately. "No," he said finally. "She's controlling the terms." Khloe nodded slightly. "Then meet her on those terms," she said. Leo closed the laptop. There was no alternative. The next day, Redwood Capital moved as it always did, efficiently, quietly, without unnecessary visibility. The building itself reflected the firm's philosophy, understated authority structure, without excess presence, without noise. Leo arrived 10 minutes early, not out of habit, out of calculation. He checked in at the front desk, his name already registered. Security granted access without delay, directing him toward the upper floors where compliance and legal departments operated. The elevator ride was silent. Mirrored walls reflecting a version of himself that felt slightly unfamiliar. Not because his appearance had changed, but because context had. Conference Room 14B was designed for clarity. A long table, neutral tones, no distractions. Documents were already arranged at each seat, organized into structured folders. Skylar was there, seated, composed, dressed in a way that aligned entirely with her role, professional, precise, without ornament. She did not stand when he entered. She did not acknowledge him beyond a brief glance that confirmed his presence. Then she returned her attention to the documents in front of her. Others were present: a senior legal advisor, a financial analyst, an internal auditor, each one positioned with purpose. Leo took his seat. Across from Skylar, the distance between them measured not in space, but in definition. The meeting began without delay. "Thank you for coming," Mr. Whitman, the legal advisor, said, his tone formal, neutral. "We'll be reviewing several outstanding items related to your submission." Leo nodded. "Of course." His voice was steady, controlled. He did not look directly at Skylar, not yet. The discussion moved methodically. Transaction summaries, revenue adjustments, account structures. Each topic introduced, examined, documented. Skylar spoke when necessary. Her voice carried no personal inflection, only clarity. On page 12, she said at one point, there is a discrepancy between the reported transaction date and the corresponding account movement. "Can you clarify the timing?" Leo responded. Providing explanation, detail, justification. She listened, not interrupting, not reacting. "Then your explanation does not align with the supporting documentation," she said evenly. "We'll need further verification on that point. No accusation, no emphasis, just conclusion." Leo felt it, not as confrontation, but as absence of recognition. There was nothing in her tone that suggested familiarity. No indication that she saw him as anything other than a subject under review. He shifted slightly in his seat. Tried again. "This can be clarified with our finance team," he said. "It's likely a reporting delay." Skylar nodded once. "Then we'll require confirmation from your finance team," she replied. The structure held, unbroken. As the meeting continued, Leo's attempts to navigate the conversation beyond its formal boundaries became more apparent. He introduced context where it was not required, added explanations that extended beyond the scope of the questions. Each time the response remained the same: redirection, precision, containment. Until finally, during a brief pause between topics, he spoke directly. "Skylar." The name entered the room differently, not as a title, not as a role, but as history. For the first time, She looked at him fully, not with emotion, not with hesitation, but with clarity. "Mr. Whitman," she said. The correction was immediate, subtle, absolute. The room registered it. Leo did not continue the sentence, because in that moment he understood something that had not been explicitly stated. There was no personal conversation here. There would not be. The meeting resumed, and from that point forward, Leo adjusted, not by choice, but by necessity. He answered questions, provided documentation, followed the structure, because there was no space left for anything else. By the time the session concluded, several items remained unresolved. Additional documentation required. Further verification pending. The deal still active had not moved closer to approval. If anything, it had deepened in complexity. "Thank you," the legal advisor said, closing his folder. "We'll follow up with next steps." Leo nodded. The meeting ended. People stood. Documents were gathered. Chairs shifted quietly against the floor. Skylar remained seated for a moment longer, organizing her materials with the same care she had applied throughout. Leo waited, not leaving immediately, not speaking, just standing there as if expecting something unscheduled to occur. Skylar finished aligning the documents, closed the folder, then stood. She did not look at him again, did not pause, did not acknowledge anything beyond the process that had just taken place. And then she left the room. Leo remained where he was for a few seconds longer. The silence that followed felt different from the silence that had preceded it. Not empty, defined. Because what had just occurred had not been a conversation. It had been a boundary, clearly drawn, precisely maintained, and impossible to ignore. Outside, the city continued as it always did. Movement, noise, unaware. But for Leo Whitman, something had shifted permanently, not because of what had been said, but because of what had not. And the realization now fully formed did not arrive as shock. It arrived as certainty. He was no longer speaking to his wife. He was answering to her. After the meeting at Redwood Capitol, the structure of control became unmistakably clear, not only in the documents that continued to circulate between departments, but in the way every interaction surrounding the Ardent Pay deal was now filtered, recorded, and measured against a standard that Leo Whitman could no longer influence directly. What had once been a negotiation driven by persuasion had transformed into a process governed entirely by verification. And within that process, Skylar Whitman remained both central and distant in a way that made any attempt to reach her outside its boundaries feel not only ineffective, but inappropriate. Leo returned to his office with a level of focus that appeared on the surface unchanged. He moved through scheduled meetings, reviewed reports, and issued instructions to his team with the same authority he had always maintained. However, beneath that continuity, something had shifted in a way that required constant adjustment. Every response he now provided was shaped not by confidence alone, but by anticipation of how it would be examined, where it might be questioned, and whether it would withstand a level of scrutiny he had not previously needed to consider. His finance team, sensing the change, began operating with a similar caution. Reports were no longer finalized without multiple layers of internal review. Supporting documentation was cross-checked before submission. Language in disclosures was revised repeatedly to eliminate any phrasing that could be interpreted as imprecise. The pace of work did not slow, but its nature changed, becoming more deliberate, more defensive, as if the company itself had begun to recognize that it was no longer building momentum, but responding to it. Despite these adjustments, the requests from Redwood did not diminish. If anything, they became more specific. Each new inquiry referenced prior submissions with increasing detail, highlighting inconsistencies not only in isolated figures, but in the relationships between them. It was no longer sufficient to explain a discrepancy. The explanation itself had to align perfectly with every other piece of information already provided. Leo understood what that meant, even if he did not articulate it openly. The review was no longer searching for clarity. It was testing consistency. And consistency, once challenged, is far more difficult to restore than it is to maintain. That evening, he remained at the office longer than usual, the city outside gradually dimming as the lights within the building stayed constant. Khloe Bennett arrived shortly after sunset, her presence quiet but intentional. She did not interrupt his work immediately. Instead, she observed, allowing the silence to settle before speaking. "You're still trying to move this forward, as if it's a negotiation," she said, her tone measured, not critical but precise. Leo did not look up right away. He continued reviewing the document in front of him, making a small adjustment to a figure before finally responding. "What else would it be?" he asked. Khloe stepped closer, placing her hand lightly against the back of the chair across from him, her attention fixed on the materials spread across the table. "It's not a negotiation anymore," she said. "It's an examination, and examinations don't respond to persuasion." Leo leaned back slightly, exhaling in a way that suggested both acknowledgement and resistance. "Everything they've asked for, we've given," he said. "There's nothing left to explain." Khloe held his gaze for a moment before replying. "If that were true, they wouldn't still be asking," she said. The statement did not provoke argument. It settled instead into the space between them, reshaping the way Leo viewed the situation, not by introducing new information, but by reframing what was already evident. He closed the file in front of him, his attention shifting fully now. "She's driving this," he said. "Every request, every escalation, it all goes through her." Khloe did not deny it. "Then you need to understand her position," she replied, "not as your wife, as the person responsible for stopping this if it doesn't hold." Leo looked away briefly, his expression tightening as he considered the implication. "She's not supposed to be involved like this," he said. "There's a conflict." Khloe shook her head slightly. "Not if she never acknowledges the personal connection," she said. "From everything you've shown me, she hasn't." Leo remained silent, because that was true. There had been no deviation in her conduct, no indication in any document or interaction that her decisions were influenced by anything outside the scope of her role, which meant that the structure she operated within protected her and limited him. Across the city, Skylar's environment remained unchanged in its composition, though its significance continued to evolve. Her daughter slept in measured intervals, her presence integrated into a routine that did not disrupt but redefined the rhythm of Skylar's day. Work resumed between those intervals, with a continuity that required no adjustment in mindset, only in timing. That evening, Skylar reviewed a new submission from Ardent Pay 1 that attempted to address several of the inconsistencies previously identified. The document was thorough, its language carefully constructed, its figures aligned with prior explanations, in a way that suggested deliberate effort. She read it once, then again, not searching for error, but for alignment. At first glance, the inconsistencies appeared resolved. The numbers matched. The timelines corresponded. The explanations followed a logical structure that held under basic examination. But Skylar did not operate at the level of basic examination. She compared the revised document against the original submissions, then against the supporting data already on file. The alignment held in isolation, but when viewed in relation to the broader dataset, something remained slightly off. Not enough to invalidate the explanation entirely, but enough to require further verification. She noted the point, marked it, then opened a separate file, her personal record. The entries remained as they had always been, objective, structured, free of interpretation. She reviewed them not as evidence of personal conduct, but as data points that might intersect with the financial patterns under examination. Dates aligned, not perfectly, but consistently. That consistency, subtle as it was, reinforced what she already understood. The issue was not in the numbers alone. It was in the relationship between actions and records. She closed the file without adding anything new, because at this stage, the existing record was sufficient. The following morning, another internal meeting was scheduled at Redwood, this time without Leo's presence. The compliance team reviewed the latest submissions, discussing their findings in a manner that remained strictly within professional boundaries. The revisions addressed the initial discrepancies, one analyst noted, pointing to a section of the document. Yes, another replied, but only when viewed independently. When cross-referenced with earlier data, the alignment becomes less stable. Skylar listened, then spoke. The explanations rely on adjusted timelines that were not previously disclosed, she said. We need confirmation that those timelines reflect actual transactions, not post hoc structuring. The room acknowledged the point because it did not challenge the submission. It required it to prove itself. By the end of the meeting, a decision was made to request additional verification this time, focusing specifically on the relationship between transaction timing and account routing. The request would be detailed, precise, and unavoidable. Skylar prepared the documentation, reviewed it once, then sent it. When Leo received the request later that day, he did not react immediately. He read it carefully, noting the level of detail, the specificity of the questions, and the way each one connected to previous submissions in a structure that left little room for interpretation. He understood now more clearly than before that this was not a process he could accelerate, only one he could endure. And endurance, unlike control, requires acceptance. Skylar closed her laptop as the evening settled in once more. Her daughter stirred lightly, then returned to sleep, her presence a quiet constant in a space defined by clarity rather than conflict. There was no sense of escalation in Skylar's mind. No anticipation of confrontation. Only progression. Because what was unfolding had already been set into motion long before Leo recognized it. Now, it was no longer about what he could say or what he could explain. It was about what could be proven and what could not. By the time pressure becomes visible, it has already begun to fracture what once appeared stable. At Ardent Pay, that fracture was no longer subtle. It did not announce itself loudly, nor did it disrupt operations in any dramatic way. But it existed in the spaces between conversations, in the pauses before responses, in the careful language employees began to use when referring to the deal that had once defined the company's future. Leo Whitman continued to lead, but leadership under scrutiny requires a different kind of discipline. Where confidence had once been sufficient, now precision was required. Every statement he made needed to align not only with internal expectations, but with an external process that no longer responded to reassurance. The latest request from Redwood Capital had arrived with a level of specificity that left no ambiguity regarding its intent. It did not question the overall structure of the deal. Instead, it focused on a narrow set of transactions, timing routing, and the relationship between financial adjustments and recorded activity. Leo read the document in full before forwarding it to his finance team, adding only a brief instruction. Full verification. No gaps. The message was concise, but the implication was clear. There was no longer room for approximation. Every detail now had to withstand independent confirmation. The response from his team was immediate, but not confident. "We'll need time," his chief financial officer replied. "Some of these records require deeper reconciliation." Leo did not respond right away. He understood what that meant, even if it was not explicitly stated. The information existed, but not in the form Redwood required. Khloe Bennett had already anticipated this stage. She had seen it before, though rarely from this proximity. Deals that reached this level of examination did not fail suddenly. They unraveled in increments, each request revealing another layer that had not been designed for exposure. She stood near the window of the office, reviewing the same document Leo had just read. Her expression controlled her attention focused. "They're narrowing the scope," she said after a moment. "That's what happens when they've identified the pattern." Leo leaned back in his chair, his gaze fixed on the ceiling for a brief second before returning to her. "There is no pattern," he said. "There are adjustments. That's normal." Khloe turned toward him, her tone unchanged. "Adjustments become patterns when they repeat under similar conditions," she replied. "And they're seeing that repetition." Leo did not argue, because the language she used reflected what he was beginning to recognize, but had not yet fully accepted. "They're interpreting it," he said instead. That doesn't mean it's wrong. Khloe considered that, then nodded slightly. No, she said, but it means you have to prove that it isn't. At Redwood Capital, the process continued without deviation. The compliance team reviewed Ardent Pay's previous submissions alongside the new request, mapping out the specific points where additional verification would either confirm or challenge the existing structure of the deal. Skylar Whitman remained consistent in her role, contributing when necessary, observing when appropriate, and ensuring that every step of the process adhered strictly to protocol. There was no escalation in her tone, no indication that the situation required urgency beyond what had already been established. Because urgency in her work did not come from pressure, it came from precision. Later that afternoon, a new document arrived from Ardent Pay. It was labeled clearly, Transaction Verification Summary. The file was extensive, containing detailed breakdowns of account movements, timestamps, and corresponding financial adjustments. Each entry was supported by documentation, each explanation structured to align with Redwood's previous inquiries. Skylar opened the file, read it once. Then again, her approach did not change. She did not assume resolution. She tested it. Each transaction was cross-referenced with existing records. Each timeline was compared against previously submitted data. At first, the alignment appeared strong. The discrepancies that had been noted earlier were addressed, their explanations consistent with the revised structure. But as she moved deeper into the file, a subtle inconsistency emerged, not in the numbers, in the sequence. Certain transactions, while individually justified, did not align logically when viewed as part of the broader timeline. Their placement suggested adjustment after the fact rather than contemporaneous recording. She paused, not because the inconsistency was unclear, but because it required confirmation. She opened additional records, accessed internal data, reviewed timestamps at a level of detail that extended beyond what had been provided. And there it was. Not immediately obvious, but precise. A misalignment of sequence. Small, but significant. Skylar documented the finding without commentary. She highlighted the relevant entries, attached supporting evidence, then drafted a concise internal note. Transaction timing appears to have been adjusted post-recording. Requires independent confirmation. No accusation. No conclusion, only identification. The note was circulated internally within Redwood's compliance and legal departments, where it was reviewed alongside the existing body of evidence. The response was measured, but the implication was clear. The issue was no longer whether the deal could proceed. It was whether it could be trusted. At Ardent Pay, Leo received another communication. This one shorter, more direct. Subject clarification required. Transaction sequence alignment. He read it carefully, his expression remaining controlled even as the weight of its implications became clear. They're questioning the sequence now, he said, more to himself than to anyone else. Khloe stepped closer, reading over his shoulder. That's where it breaks, she said quietly. Leo looked at her. What do you mean? She met his gaze, her tone steady. If they prove the sequence was adjusted after the fact, it changes the interpretation of everything else. Leo exhaled slowly, his mind moving through the implications with increasing clarity. It doesn't mean it was intentional, he said. Khloe nodded. No, she agreed. But it means they'll treat it as if it could have been. The room fell into silence. Not the kind that suggests uncertainty, but the kind that confirms understanding. Because at this stage, the distinction between intention and interpretation no longer belonged to Leo. It belonged to Redwood. Across the city, Skylar closed the file. Her work for the day was nearly complete. Her daughter stirred in the bassinet, her small movements drawing Skylar's attention away from the screen. She stood lifting the child, gently adjusting her position with a natural ease that required no thought. For a moment, the world reduced itself to that single interaction. Quiet, contained, uncomplicated. Then, just as smoothly, her attention returned to the larger structure she had been building, not out of obligation, but because it was already in motion. Leo remained at his desk long after the office had emptied. The documents in front of him no longer represented opportunity. They represented exposure. Every line, every number, or every adjustment carried a weight that had not been present before. He understood now that the process was no longer moving toward approval. It was moving toward determination, and determination, once reached, would not be influenced by explanation, only by evidence. Skylar across the city did not consider what would happen next in terms of outcome. She did not anticipate confrontation. She did not imagine resolution, because for her the process itself was the resolution. Each step, each document, each verified detail, all of it forming a structure that would stand on its own, unaffected by opinion, unaffected by intent, defined entirely by what could be proven. And as that structure neared completion, one thing became increasingly clear, though no one stated it directly. The question was no longer whether Leo Whitman's deal would succeed. It was whether it had ever truly been stable to begin with. By the time a system begins to close around a set of facts, resistance no longer changes its direction. It only reveals how unprepared the subject is for what has already been established. Leo Whitman had reached that point without fully recognizing it. He continued to respond, to submit, to explain, but the process he was moving through no longer required his interpretation. It required alignment, and alignment was something he could no longer manufacture. At Redwood Capital, the internal review entered its final phase without announcement. There was no visible escalation, no formal declaration that the situation had reached a decisive threshold. Instead, the structure simply narrowed. The number of variables reduced. The questions became fewer, but more exact. Skylar Whitman understood this transition not as a turning point, but as a continuation. Everything that had been identified, documented, and verified now existed within a framework that no longer required expansion. It required confirmation. The final step was not dramatic. It was precise. The compliance team convened in a restricted session, limited to senior personnel whose roles intersected directly with the decision that would follow. Legal counsel, financial auditors, and risk analysts reviewed the compiled findings, each component presented in a sequence that reflected the order in which it had been uncovered. Skylar presented only what was necessary. She did not summarize beyond the evidence. She did not interpret beyond what had already been verified. Her role was not to persuade. It was to ensure that nothing within the structure could be questioned for lack of clarity. Transaction alignment confirms post-recording adjustments, she stated at one point, referencing the sequence that had become central to the review. The timing discrepancies are consistent across multiple entries and correlate with external activity not disclosed in the original submission. The room remained focused. There were no interruptions, because the statement did not invite debate. It reflected confirmation. Additional materials were introduced. Email correspondence between Leo and members of his internal team referencing the adjustments in language that suggested awareness of inconsistencies prior to submission. Not explicit admissions, but directional, sufficient to establish context. Bank records followed, detailed, time-stamped, showing movement between accounts that aligned not with operational necessity, but with structural modification. Each document individually could be explained. Collectively, they formed a pattern. Skylar did not present everything at once. She allowed the sequence to unfold as it had originally. Because understanding, when built step by step, does not require emphasis. It becomes self-evident. Then finally, she introduced two additional pieces of evidence, not because they were more important, but because they completed the structure. The first was a video, sourced from hospital security records, time-stamped, showing Leo Whitman leaving the building during the early hours of the morning on the night Skylar had been admitted for labor. The footage was clear, uninterrupted. Leo moving through the hallway, phone in hand, not returning. There was no commentary attached, no explanation provided, because none was required. The second was an audio file, Short, extracted from a recorded call obtained through internal legal channels during the course of the review. Leo's voice was identifiable, calm, unaware of the context in which the recording would later be examined. "I'll handle it," he said in the recording. "We just need to adjust the sequence so it lines up. It won't raise questions if it looks consistent." The sentence was brief, but complete. The room remained silent after the audio ended. Not because the content was shocking, but because it resolved what had previously required interpretation. Skylar did not speak immediately. She allowed the material to settle. Then, when she did speak, her tone remained unchanged. "These materials are included to provide context for the sequence adjustments identified in the financial review," she said. "They are not presented as standalone conclusions, but as supporting alignment." The distinction was important because it ensured that the process remained within its defined boundaries: evidence, structure, conclusion. The legal counsel reviewed the documentation one final time. The auditors confirmed their findings. The risk assessment team provided their evaluation. The decision, when it came, was not announced with emphasis. It was recorded, formally. Within the system, Ardent Pay Acquisition Proposal Status, suspended pending investigation. Across the city, Leo Whitman received the notification without preparation. He read it once, then again. The words did not change, because they did not need to. The meaning was clear. Not delayed, not under review. Suspended. The distinction was absolute. Khloe Bennett stood nearby watching him as he processed the information. She did not ask what it meant. She already knew. Instead, she waited. Because this was not a moment that required interpretation. It required acceptance. Leo closed the laptop slowly, his movements controlled, though no longer confident. "They're stopping it," he said. Khloe nodded. Yes. There was no elaboration, because none would alter the outcome. Leo stood walking toward the window, his reflection faint against the glass. For the first time since the deal had begun, he did not reach for explanation. He did not consider strategy. He did not attempt to reframe what had happened, because the structure that had formed around him no longer allowed for adjustment. It allowed only recognition. At Redwood, the process continued beyond the decision. Formal documentation was prepared, internal records updated, notifications sent to relevant parties. Skylar completed her role as she had begun it, without deviation, without expression beyond what was required. She reviewed the final report, confirmed its accuracy, and submitted it. There was no moment of pause, no reflection within the system itself, because for Redwood, this was not an event. It was a function. At home, Skylar sat in the same space she'd occupied throughout the process. Her daughter rested nearby, her presence unchanged, unaffected by the structures that had unfolded beyond her awareness. Skylar did not open her laptop again that evening. There was nothing left to review, nothing left to confirm. The process, as it related to her, had reached its conclusion. Leo remained standing at the window long after the notification had been received. The city moved below him, unchanged, indifferent to the shift that had just occurred. He understood now that the deal was not simply paused. It was compromised. And with it, everything that had depended on it. His company, his position, his credibility, each one connected, each one affected. Khloe moved quietly behind him, her presence no longer aligned with the certainty that had defined their earlier conversations. She did not touch him, did not speak, because proximity in moments like this does not restore alignment. It reveals distance. Skylar across the city did not consider Leo, not in that moment, not in the way he might have expected, because for her, the process had never been about him. It had been about structure, and now that the structure was complete, there was nothing left to hold in place. What remained would not be decided in meetings, or documents, or systems. It would unfold elsewhere, in spaces where evidence no longer needed to be gathered, only presented. And as the final report settled into record, one truth stood without needing to be spoken. Leo Whitman had not lost control in a single moment. He had relinquished it gradually, and by the time he understood where it had gone, it no longer belonged to him. Once a structure collapses, it does not do so all at once. It weakens in layers, each one giving way under the weight of what has already been exposed. For Leo Whitman, the suspension of the Ardent Pay acquisition was not the end. It was the beginning of a sequence that would unfold with a precision he could no longer influence. The notification from Redwood Capital had been clear in its language, but its implications extended far beyond the document itself. Within hours, the internal response at Ardent Pay began to take shape not through confrontation, but through distance. Board members requested an emergency session. Senior executives began reviewing internal exposure. Legal advisors moved quietly assessing risk, not in terms of possibility, but in terms of documentation. Leo was still CEO. But authority once questioned does not disappear, it shifts. And that shift had already begun. The board meeting was scheduled for the following morning. No delay, no adjustment for convenience. Because timing in moments like this is not negotiable. Leo entered the conference room with the same composure he had maintained throughout the process, but the atmosphere within the room no longer responded to that composure in the same way. Where there had once been alignment, there was now assessment. The chair of the board, Daniel Reeves, opened the meeting without preamble. "We've reviewed Redwood's status update," he said, his tone measured, controlled. "We need a clear understanding of the situation." Leo nodded. "The deal is under further investigation," he said. "This is procedural." Daniel interrupted him, not abruptly, but definitively. "It is not procedural," he said. "It is suspension." The correction did not carry emotion. It carried fact. Leo paused, recalibrating. "They've raised concerns about certain transaction sequences," he continued. "We are addressing those concerns." Another board member spoke. "Are those concerns valid?" The question did not allow for generalization. Leo considered his response carefully. "They are based on interpretation," he said. "We believe they can be resolved." The room remained still. Not convinced, not yet opposed, but no longer aligned. Outside the boardroom, the company had already begun to adjust. Conversations that once centered on expansion shifted toward containment. Teams that had been preparing for growth began reviewing existing structures for stability. The narrative changed, not publicly, but internally. And internal narratives once altered are difficult to restore. Khloe Bennett did not attend the board meeting. Her position within Ardent Pay did not extend to formal governance. But her absence did not distance her from its outcome. She waited in Leo's office, reviewing messages that had begun to arrive from external contacts, investors, media representatives, industry partners, each one reflecting a subtle shift in tone. Questions framed as concern, inquiries presented as support, language that suggested awareness without confirmation. She understood what it meant. The information had begun to circulate, not as a statement, but as a signal. When Leo returned, his expression had changed in a way that required no explanation. "They're forming a review committee," he said. Khloe nodded once. That was expected. Leo moved past her, setting his phone down with more force than necessary. "They want access to everything," he continued. "Internal communications, financial records, full transparency." Khloe watched him carefully. "They're protecting themselves," she said. Leo turned toward her. "And what about me?" The question lingered, not because it required an answer, but because the answer was already clear. Over the next 48 hours, Ardent Pay transitioned into a state that no longer resembled forward movement. Legal teams expanded their involvement. External auditors were brought in. Communication protocols were tightened, limiting who could speak and what could be said. Leo remained in position, but his role had changed. He was no longer directing the process. He was subject to it. At Redwood Capital, the file had moved beyond active review. The suspension remained in place, and the internal investigation continued without urgency, because urgency was no longer required. The outcome of the deal had already been determined. Skylar Whitman's involvement had formally concluded. Her final report had been submitted, reviewed, and accepted. There were no further actions required from her. And so, she returned fully to the structure of her routine. That structure now included one additional step: legal filing. The decision to file for divorce was not made in response to a single event. It had formed gradually aligned with the same clarity that had guided her throughout the process. By the time the paperwork was prepared, it was not a reaction. It was completion. Skylar reviewed the documents with the same precision she applied to everything else. Names, dates, terms, each line confirmed, each clause understood. There was no urgency in her actions, no visible emotion, because the decision itself had already been made long before the document existed. She signed, closed the folder, and submitted it. Leo received the notice 2 days later, not through conversation, not through explanation, but through formal delivery. He read the document in his office, the language precise, the structure familiar in a way that made it impossible to misinterpret. Petition for dissolution of marriage, filed by Skylar Whitman. No additional commentary, no personal message attached, just process. He read it again, then set it down slowly, as if doing so might delay the meaning from settling. Khloe stood across from him, her expression unreadable. "She filed," he said. Khloe did not move. "Yes," she replied. Leo exhaled, his mind moving through the sequence of events that had led to this moment, not as isolated decisions, but as a continuous line. The hospital, the deal, the review, the suspension. And now, this. "Do you want to contest it?" Khloe asked. Leo did not answer immediately, because the question assumed something he was no longer certain of: control. He looked at the document again, at the structure, at the clarity with which it had been prepared. And for the first time, he understood that this was not something that could be negotiated in the way he was accustomed to. Because Skylar had not approached it as a conflict, she had approached it as a process. And within that process, there was no space for argument, only outcome. Khloe stepped back slightly, the distance between them no longer subtle. "You need to decide how you respond," she said. Leo nodded faintly. But the response, whatever it would be, did not come immediately. Because for the first time, response required something he had not prepared for: acknowledgement. Across the city, Skylar held her daughter in the quiet of the evening. The apartment unchanged, the world outside continuing without interruption. There was no sense of conclusion in her posture, no indication that anything had ended. Because for her, this was not an ending. It was a continuation, a transition from one structure to another, one that required no explanation, no justification, only consistency. At Arden Pay, the review committee continued its work. At Redwood, the file remained closed. And between those two systems, the consequences of Leo Whitman's decisions continued to unfold, not through confrontation, but through alignment. Because once truth has been documented, it does not need to be defended. It only needs to be presented. And everything that follows will adjust accordingly. The final stages of any process are rarely defined by drama. They are defined by clarity. By the time Leo Whitman entered the courtroom, there was nothing left to uncover, nothing left to argue into existence. Everything that mattered had already been documented, structured, and aligned within systems that did not require emotion to function. The courthouse stood in quiet contrast to the corporate environments where Leo had built his career. There were no glass walls, no polished presentations, no language designed to persuade. Instead, there was procedure measured deliberate and indifferent to narrative. Skylar Whitman arrived early, not out of anticipation, but out of habit. She carried no visible tension, no sign that the moment held any weight beyond what it required. Her posture remained composed, her attention steady, her presence aligned entirely with the purpose of the hearing. Her daughter was not with her. She had arranged care elsewhere, ensuring that nothing within the environment would distract from the process itself. Leo arrived shortly after. His appearance remained consistent with the image he had maintained: publicly controlled, composed, carefully presented. But there was a difference, subtle, yet unmistakable, in the way he moved. The certainty that had once defined his presence had been replaced by something quieter, not hesitation, recognition. The courtroom filled gradually, though not with an audience. There were no observers beyond those directly involved. Legal representatives took their places. Documents were organized. The structure of the proceedings settled into place without announcement. Skylar sat at one table, Leo at another. The distance between them was not large, but it was absolute. The judge entered. The case was called, and the process began. There were no opening statements that sought to redefine the past, no attempts to reshape events into something more favorable. Because the structure of the case did not require interpretation. It required confirmation. Skylar's legal counsel presented the documentation first: the marriage record, the timeline of separation. The evidence submitted not to accuse, but to establish context. Emails, financial records, hospital documentation. Each item introduced with precision, each one accepted without challenge. Leo's counsel reviewed the materials, not contesting their validity, but ensuring their completeness, because there was no strategic advantage in denial, only in acknowledgement. Skylar was called to speak. She stood not as someone seeking validation, but as someone completing a process already in motion. Her testimony was brief, structured, aligned with the documentation. She did not describe emotion. She did not assign blame. She did not revisit moments for emphasis. She confirmed dates, events, decisions, and then she stopped, because there was nothing more to add. Leo was given the opportunity to respond. He stood, his posture steady, his voice controlled. He did not deny the sequence of events. He did not attempt to reinterpret them. Instead, he spoke in a way that reflected an understanding that had come too late to change anything. "I acknowledge the facts as presented," he said. The statement was simple, complete, and within it there was no defense. The judge reviewed the materials, asked a small number of clarifying questions, confirmed the terms of custody which had been outlined clearly within the filing. Skylar was granted primary custody of their daughter. Leo was assigned structured visitation. The financial terms were established based on documented assets and obligations. There was no dispute, because the structure had already been agreed upon. The final order was issued, not with emphasis, not with finality in the way people often expect, but as a continuation of the process. The marriage legally was dissolved. When it ended, there was no pause, no moment of acknowledgement between them. Skylar gathered her documents, closed her folder, and stood. She did not look at Leo, not because she was avoiding him, but because there was nothing left to address. Leo remained seated for a moment longer, not out of resistance, but because movement required a different kind of certainty now, one that did not come from control, but from acceptance. He watched as Skylar exited the courtroom. Her steps measured, her posture unchanged. There was no visible trace of what had passed between them, no indication of loss, only direction, forward. Outside, the day continued as it always did. People moved through the city without awareness of what had just concluded within the walls of the courthouse. Skylar stepped into that movement without hesitation. She did not stop, did not turn, did not look back, because her path did not require reference to what had ended. It required only continuation. Leo exited shortly after. The space outside the courthouse felt larger than before, though nothing had changed. He stood for a moment, observing the movement around him, the absence of anything that reflected the significance of what had just occurred. Because significance in moments like this is not shared. It is carried. Khloe Bennett was not there. Her absence, like many things now, required no explanation. Their alignment had shifted gradually, then completely. Not through conflict, but through divergence. And divergence, once established, does not reverse. Leo did not attempt to follow Skylar. He did not call out, because for the first time he understood that proximity did not restore connection, and that some distances once created are not meant to be closed. Across the city, Skylar returned to the apartment. The space remained, as it had always been structured, quiet, aligned with her presence. Her daughter rested where she had left her, undisturbed, unaware of the legal conclusion that had just redefined the framework of her life. Skylar lifted her gently, holding her close, with the same steady care that had guided her through everything else. There was no change in her expression, no visible shift, because the process had not altered who she was. It had confirmed it. Later that evening, Skylar sat by the window, the city lights reflecting softly against the glass, her daughter asleep beside her. There were no documents open, no files to review, no decisions pending. For the first time in weeks, her work was complete. Not because everything had been resolved, but because everything that required her involvement had been addressed. She did not revisit the past, did not reconsider the sequence of events, because for her understanding had never depended on reflection. It had been established through observation, through alignment, through truth. And now, with nothing left to prove, nothing left to document, and nothing left to hold in place, Skylar Whitman did what she had always done. She moved forward, not with noise, not with declaration, but with the same quiet strength that had defined her from the beginning. Somewhere else in the city, Leo Whitman remained standing in a space that no longer belonged to him in the way it once had. His position, his certainty, his future, all of it had shifted, not in a single moment, but through a series of decisions that had aligned into consequence. And while he could trace those decisions back step by step to where they began, he could not return to change them, because the structure that now existed had already accounted for everything. There was no final confrontation, no closing exchange, no need for either, because the truth once fully assembled does not require reinforcement. It stands, and everything else adjusts around it. In the end, what remained was not a story of revenge, nor one of victory in the way people often define it. It was something quieter, something more enduring. A record of choices made without noise of boundaries, drawn without confrontation of truth, allowed to unfold without interference. Skylar did not raise her voice yet. Everything she needed to say was heard through what she chose to do. She did not seek to expose Leo yet. The structure of his own actions revealed more than any accusation could have. And when the moment came to leave, she did so without hesitation, carrying with her not anger, but clarity. There is a certain strength in that kind of silence. Not the silence of avoidance, but the silence of certainty, the kind that does not argue, because it no longer needs to convince anyone of what is already evident. Leo, in his own way, came to understand that. Not through explanation, but through consequence. Not through confrontation, but through the absence of it. And perhaps that is where the real weight of this story rests, not in what was lost, but in what was revealed. If you've stayed with this story until the end, you've witnessed something that unfolds slowly, but leaves a lasting impression. If it resonated with you, you can let me know where you're watching, from what time it is, where you are, and what moment stayed with you the most. And if you find value in stories that explore truth, dignity, and the quiet strength of restraint, you're welcome to stay connected for more.